The spring of 1861 did not arrive in Shenandoah Valley with the promise of life. It arrived with the heavy, suffocating static of a gathering storm. The dogwood trees were in full bloom, painting the Virginia hills in strokes of white and pink, but the beauty felt deceptive. In the small town of Harrows Creek, the air tasted of iron and anxiety. Men gathered in clusters on porch steps, clutching newspapers that arrived 3 days late from Richmond, their voices low, but their eyes burning with a fever that would soon consume the nation. Elias Thorne stood by the anvil in his father's smithy, the rhythmic clang of his hammer drowning out the murmurs from the street. Elias was 22, with shoulders broadened by labor and a temperament that was as steady as the steel he worked. But today, his hands trembled slightly. The news had reached them at dawn. Virginia had seceded. The die was cast. The Union was broken. By late afternoon, the town square had transformed into a theater of patriotism and rage. A makeshift recruitment table had been set up outside the general store. Young men, boys really, were lining up, eager to sign their names for a chance to whip the Yankees before the harvest. And there, in the center of the fervor, stood Julian Vance. Julian was everything Elias was not: wealthy, charismatic, and reckless. They had been inseparable since they were children, running barefoot through the creek, hunting in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and dreaming of lives that didn't involve the looming shadow of war. Julian's family owned one of the largest tobacco plantations in the county, while Elias was the son of a blacksmith. Yet, class had never been a wall between them until today. Elias wiped the soot from his forehead and walked out into the blinding sunlight. He found Julian standing atop a crate, a glass of whiskey raised high, his face flushed with the intoxication of the moment. "To Virginia!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "To our homes! Let Lincoln send his armies. We will show them that a Virginian fights with the strength of 10 men. The crowd roared. Elias felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He didn't cheer. He couldn't. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, the crowd dispersed. Elias found Julian sitting on the wooden railing of the bridge that spanned the creek, their old meeting spot. Julian was still nursing a bottle of rye, but the manic energy had faded, replaced by a somber quietness. "You didn't cheer, Eli," Julian said, not looking up. He took a swig from the bottle. "There's nothing to cheer for, Jules," Elias replied softly, leaning against the wooden beam. "You're talking about war. You're talking about killing men who were our countrymen yesterday." Julian jumped down, his boots landing heavy on the dust. "They stopped being our countrymen when they threatened our sovereignty, when they decided they could dictate how we live from a swamp in Washington City. I'm joining the 33rd Infantry tomorrow. You should come with me. Think of it, Thorne and Vance riding together, just like old times." Elias looked at his friend, the boy who had once pulled him out of a raging river, the man who had shared his bread when times were lean. This was the hardest conversation of his life. "I can't," Elias whispered. Julian froze. The silence between them stretched, heavier than the humid air. "What do you mean you can't? Are you a coward?" "You know I'm not." Elias stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "But I won't raise a weapon against the flag, Julian. My grandfather died for that flag in 1812. The Union, it's flawed, yes, but tearing it apart, that's not the answer. Slavery, the politics, it's poisoning us. I can't fight to preserve a world that needs to change." Julian's face hardened. The warmth of friendship evaporated, replaced by the cold logic of war. So, you're with them. You're a Yankee sympathizer? I'm an American, Elias said firmly, and I'm leaving tonight. I'm crossing the Potomac into Maryland. I'm going to enlist in the Union Army. The admission hung in the air like a gunshot. Julian gripped the bottle so hard his knuckles turned white. For a moment, Elias thought Julian might strike him. Instead, Julian laughed, a dry, bitter sound. Then this is it, Julian said. The Great Divide. It's not just lines on a map anymore, is it? It's right here, between you and me. Julian uncorked the bottle again. He poured a small amount onto the wooden planks of the bridge, a libation for something dead. Then he took a long pull and handed the bottle to Elias. One last drink, Julian said, his voice trembling barely perceptibly. The parting glass. Because the next time I see you, Elias, I look down the barrel of a rifle, I won't hesitate. And I expect you to do the same. Elias took the bottle. The amber liquid burned his throat, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. He wiped his mouth and handed it back. I hope it never comes to that, Elias replied. It will, Julian replied, turning his back. Go, before I remember that I'm supposed to arrest traitors. Elias didn't look back. He walked to his father's shop, packed a small rucksack with bread, cheese, and a warm coat. He took his grandfather's compass and a small tin-type photograph of his mother. He said a silent goodbye to the house he was born in, knowing he might never see its walls again. Under the cover of darkness, Elias made his way toward the river. The night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant rushing of water. As he reached the banks of the Potomac, he looked back toward the south, toward Harrow's Creek. Somewhere back there, Julian was likely sleeping, or perhaps polishing a bayonet, dreaming of glory. Elias stepped into the small skiff hidden in the reeds. As he pushed off from the muddy bank, the water turned black and ominous. The current caught the boat, pulling him toward the Maryland shore. He wasn't just crossing a river, he was crossing a line that had severed his heart in two. Behind him lay his past, his best friend, and his home. Ahead lay uncertainty, fire, and the bloodiest fields in American history. The bond was broken. The war had begun, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, agonizing crack of a friendship splintering under the weight of belief. Elias rode into the mist, the echo of the parting glass still burning in his chest. September 17, 1862, dawned with a deceptively gentle fog hugging the rolling hills of Maryland. To a distant observer, the landscape around Sharpsburg looked like a painting. Fields of tall green corn, white fenced turnpikes, and the lazy winding of Antietam Creek. But for Private Elias Thorne, crouching in the wet grass with the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, the fog smelled of sulfur and wet wool. It had been 17 months since Elias crossed the Potomac, 17 months that had chiseled the softness of youth from his face, leaving behind a gaunt, bearded mask of exhaustion. The innocence of the smithy was gone, replaced by the mechanical indifference of a soldier. "Fix bayonets," the order rippled down the line, hushed but urgent. The metallic clack-clack-clack of steel locking onto rifle barrels sounded like the chatter of teeth in the cold. Elias gripped his Springfield rifle, his knuckles white. Beside him, a boy named Thomas, no older than 16, was muttering the Lord's Prayer. Elias didn't pray. He just thought of the anvil back home, solid, unmoving, unbreakable. He tried to become the anvil. Then the sun burned through the mist and hell opened its maw. They stepped into Miller's cornfield. The stalks were high, rising above their heads, creating a green labyrinth. For a moment, there was only the sound of thousands of boots crushing the vegetation. Then, the Confederate artillery on the ridge screamed. The air turned into a storm of iron. Canister shot, tin cans filled with lead balls tore through the corn like invisible scythes. Elias saw men to his left simply dissolve in a spray of red mist. The noise was beyond deafening. It was a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. "Forward! Keep moving!" the sergeant roared, only to be cut down a second later. Elias stumbled over a body, his face splashing into the mud. He scrambled up, gasping for air that was thick with black powder smoke. The cornfield, once green and tall, had been leveled as if by a great storm. Through the gray haze, he saw them, the ghostly gray lines of the Confederate infantry. The two armies slammed into each other with the ferocity of trapped animals. It wasn't a battle of strategy anymore, it was a brawl. Elias fired, reloaded, His movements were jerky, instinctive. He bit off the paper cartridges, the taste of gunpowder sharp and salty on his tongue, rammed the rod down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. He didn't aim at men, he aimed at the gray mass in front of him. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed high, baking the dead and the dying. The battle shifted toward a sunken farm lane, a depressed road that would soon earn the name Bloody Lane. Elias found himself prone at the edge of the embankment, firing down into the road where the Confederates were entrenched. The ditch was filled with bodies, layered like cordwood. The groans of the wounded were drowned out by the ceaseless rattle of musketry. Suddenly, a surge of gray uniforms broke from the smoke, a desperate countercharge to push the Union back. The rebel yell, that high-pitched, ululating scream, pierced the din. Elias scrambled back, his boots slipping on the blood-slicked grass. He dropped his rifle, fumbling for his bayonet. A Confederate soldier lunged at him, eyes wild with terror and rage. Elias parried the blow with his forearm, ignoring the searing pain, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. They tumbled to the ground, rolling in the dirt. Elias managed to kick the man away and scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. He looked up, scanning the chaos for a weapon, for help, for anything. And then, through a rift in the smoke, he saw him. Less than 20 yards away, a Confederate officer was rallying his men, waving a saber that caught the glint of the midday sun. His uniform was tattered, his hat gone, his face smeared with soot and blood. But the posture, the defiant tilt of the head, the reckless courage was unmistakable. It was Julian. Time seemed to warp, the roar of the battle fading into a dull hum. Elias froze. The man he had grown up with, the brother of his soul, was right there. Julian was screaming orders, pointing toward the Union flank. He looked older, harder, his eyes hollowed by the same horrors Elias had witnessed. Elias's hand moved to his holster, drawing his Colt revolver. He raised it. The distance was short. He couldn't miss. "He's the enemy!" a voice in his head screamed. "He's leading them to kill you." "He's Julian," his heart whispered. "He taught you to swim." Julian turned. For a fraction of a second, across the field of fire, their eyes locked. There was no hatred in that exchange, only a devastating, crushing recognition. Julian's saber lowered slightly. He stopped shouting. He stood exposed amidst the whizzing bullets, staring at the friend he had promised to kill. Elias's finger hovered over the trigger. His hand shook, not from fear, but from a grief so profound it felt like dying. He couldn't do it. He lowered the gun. "Get down!" Elias screamed, his voice tearing from his throat. But the war did not care for their friendship. It did not care for mercy. Before Julian could react, A Union artillery shell slammed into the earth just 10 feet behind him. The ground erupted in a geyser of dirt, fire, and shrapnel. The shockwave knocked Elias off his feet, throwing him backward into a ditch. Darkness swallowed him. When Elias came to, the sky was a bruised purple. The shooting had stopped, replaced by a sound far worse, the collective moaning of thousands of wounded men crying out for water, for their mothers, for death. He coughed, spitting up dirt, and dragged himself to the lip of the crater. He looked toward where Julian had stood. There was nothing but a scorched crater and a pile of debris. Elias fell to his knees in the mud of Antietam. He clutched the broken hilt to his chest and let out a scream that carried no words, a sound of pure desolation that joined the chorus of the damned. The battle was over. The field was theirs. But as Elias looked over the carnage of Sharpsburg, he realized that in this war there were no victors. There were only those who survived and those who were lost in the fields of fire. The bond wasn't just broken now, it was buried.
The war officially ended with ink on paper at Appomattox, but for Elias Thorne, it didn't end until he saw the charred skeleton of the bridge at Harrow's Creek. It was the autumn of 1865. The Virginia air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, but the landscape was scarred. Fences were gone, burned for firewood by shivering armies. The fields, once white with cotton or green with tobacco, were now overgrown with briars and sumac. Elias walked with a limp, a souvenir from a skirmish near Petersburg, but he walked as a free man. Yet, as he entered the town, he felt the weight of 1,000 ghosts. He was the victor, wearing the faded blue coat of the Union, but in his hometown, he was a pariah. Curtains twitched in windows. Old men spat on the dusty road as he passed. To them, he was not a hero. He was the reason their sons hadn't come home. He reached his father's smithy. The roof had partially collapsed, and the bellows were rotted with mildew. The anvil, however, remained. Rust-colored and cold, it sat in the center of the shop, an unmovable testament to the life that was. Elias set to work. It was the only way he knew how to keep the madness at bay. For weeks, he spoke to no one. He cleared the debris, patched the roof, and scrubbed the rust from the tools. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the hammer returned to the valley. At first, it was a lonely sound, an echo of the past, but slowly it became a heartbeat. The town needed plows mended and horses shod, regardless of politics. Pride eventually bowed to necessity, and customers began to trickle in, offering silent nods instead of conversation. But the silence that haunted Elias most was the one from the Vance plantation. He had heard rumors. The Vance manor had been used as a field hospital, then looted. The family was destitute. But of Julian, there was no word. Elias kept the shattered saber hilt from Antietam wrapped in a cloth on his mantelpiece, a relic of a friendship he believed lay buried in Maryland mud. One rainy afternoon in November, the sound of a wagon wheel crunching on gravel broke Elias's concentration. He looked up from the glowing forge. A mule, ribs showing through its hide, was pulling a rickety cart, and sitting on the driver's bench, hunched against the cold, was a figure that stopped Elias's heart. The man climbed down with agonizing slowness. He adjusted a wooden crutch under his left arm. His left trouser leg was pinned up at the knee. He wore a tattered gray coat that was too big for his gaunt frame.
Elias dropped his tongs. The red-hot horseshoe fell into the cooling tub with a hiss of steam. "Julian?" he whispered. The man turned. A thick scar ran from his jawline to his ear, pulling his mouth into a permanent, cynical grimace. But the eyes, weary, aged, yet piercing, were the same. Julian Vance hobbled toward the open barn doors of the smithy. He stopped a few feet away, leaning heavily on the crutch. For a long minute, neither man spoke. The rain hammered against the tin roof, filling the space between them. "I heard the hammer," Julian said, his voice raspy, as if unused. Sounded like the only thing alive in this god-forsaken valley. Elias wiped his soot-stained hands on his apron, his chest tightening. "I thought you were dead. At Sharpsburg. The shell. I lost the leg there." Julian tapped the empty space where his shin should have been. "And I lost my hearing in one ear. Spent the rest of the war in a Union prison camp in Elmira, coldest place on God's green earth." He looked at Elias's blue coat hanging on a peg. "Seems you fared better." "I survived," Elias said quietly. "I don't know if that means I fared better." Julian scoffed, but it lacked the venom of 1861. He looked around the shop. "We lost everything, Eli. The land is being sold for taxes. The house is a shell. They say this is Reconstruction, but it feels more like a slow funeral." "It can be rebuilt," Elias said, stepping closer. "Can it?" Julian met his gaze. "You saw me that day, in the cornfield. You had your pistol raised." Elias froze. He hadn't known if Julian had seen him through the smoke. "Yes." "Why didn't you shoot?" Julian asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was desperate. "You had me dead to rights. I would have shot you." "No, you wouldn't have," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. He lost his balance slightly and gripped the anvil for support. "I was full of hate, Eli. I wanted to burn the world down." "I lowered the gun because you weren't a soldier to me," Elias said, his voice steady. "You were the boy who fished with me in the creek. You were my brother. The uniform didn't change that. The war tried to kill it, but it couldn't." Julian stared at the anvil, his knuckles white. The anger seemed to drain out of him, leaving only a profound exhaustion. He slumped against the heavy iron block. "I saw you lowered it," Julian whispered, "just before the world exploded. That memory, it was the only thing that kept me from going mad in that prison camp. The thought that somewhere, in the middle of all that blood, there was one moment of mercy." Elias reached out and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. This time, Julian didn't pull away. "We can't fix the past, Jules, and we can't bring back the dead. But we're here. We're still standing. That has to count for something." Julian looked up, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a flask. It wasn't fine whiskey anymore. It was cheap moonshine. He offered it to Elias. "No parting glass this time," Julian said, a faint, crooked smile touching his lips. Elias took the flask. No, a gathering glass. He took a drink and handed it back. The burn was harsh, but it felt grounding. "I need help," Elias said, gesturing to the shop. "My leg acts up when it rains. I can't work the bellows and the hammer at the same time. I can't pay you much, but I can't exactly plow a field with one leg," Julian interrupted, looking at the forge.
but I reckon I can work a bellows. My arms are strong enough." Elias smiled, a genuine smile, the first in 4 years. "Start tomorrow?" "Start tomorrow," Julian agreed. They walked together to the doorway of the smithy, looking out at the rain-soaked valley. The scars were there, on the land, on their bodies, and in their minds. The road ahead would be long. The bitterness of the town wouldn't vanish overnight. But as they stood there, a Yankee blacksmith and a crippled rebel planter, the divide began to close. The house had been divided, and it had nearly fallen. But in the quiet warmth of the forge, the slow, painful work of reconstruction had finally begun.